Welcome back to 4547blog.com presents the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, NINJ, and this wasn't a slow news week at all. This was a stress test. While the media was screaming and protesting and they spiraled out of control, the Trump administration kept it moving. They were enforcing the law, nominating power players, pushing foreign policy forward, and reminding everyone that government doesn't stop just because activists want it to. Just because people come out and start blowing their whistles as hard as they can and kicking out the taillights of federal vehicles. Immigration enforcement tightened, federal authority was challenged in the streets and inside of churches, out of all things. A major media figure found out that press credentials are not immunity. Our markets reacted, our institutions shifted, our allies were armed, and Washington reminded the country who actually holds the levers of power inside of our country and outside. This show isn't about, viral outrage or emotional headlines. It's about control versus chaos, governance versus performance, or authority versus a bunch of freaking noise. So today we're breaking down what actually happened this week, what matters, what doesn't, and what it all signals about, where this administration is headed next. So let's get right into it. Let's strip this week down to the facts, not feelings, not hashtags, not media meltdowns. So first, it's the immigration enforcement. The Trump administration did not retreat. It didn't pause. It didn't apologize. Enforcement expanded this week, and exactly what always follows happened next. Some frickin' protests. Not quiet marches, not symbolic rallies, but organized disruptions, walkouts, and coordinated demonstrations that are designed to interfere with everyone's daily life. So finally, enforcement went up. But in effect, you know what happened. The opposition escalated. And that's not chaos. This is cause and effect, everyone. Next came the DHS funding and the dysfunction in Washington. Congress once again flirted with a freaking funding crisis, using the Department of Homeland Security as leverage. It's the same tactic. It's a different calendar year. It's just the same shit, different smell. Immigration enforcement remains the pressure point because it's the one issue that the administration refuses to fold on, and they shouldn't. Funding becomes the weapon that, votes aren't enough. But what they're not saying is that funding for ICE has already been funded through 2029, and they're just trying to take away how it's getting allocated. But that's going to be a hard thing if the Republicans don't move on it. Then the Don Lemon arrest. So a former national media figure from CNN, he was taken into federal custody on charges tied to conduct during a, protest at a church, like an idiot. Every other media reaction was immediate, and it was emotional, and it was cries of, press freedom, and it echoed within minutes. But the charges weren't about what was said. They were about what was done. This wasn't a reporter being silenced. This was the federal government drawing a line between covering an event and actually freaking participating in it. Finally. The markets reacted this week because they always do. Uncertainty about the Federal Reserve leadership situation, spending fights in Congress, and protest-driven instability sent signals to Wall Street that they don't tolerate well. The volatility followed. No mystery there. The markets don't care about the freaking narratives. They care about the predictability, and they're trying to figure out which way the markets are going to move as usual. It always rebounds. I wouldn't worry about it too much. And while domestic critics protested, foreign policy didn't pause. There was major arms sales that were approved, alliances were reinforced, there were strategic messages that were sent overseas, while the political class here at home argued about freaking optics and tones and their outrage cycle as usual. That was this week, not a collapse, not a crisis, it's a collision. The government action is on one side, the opposition noise is on the other, and the media, they're doing what they do best. They're amplifying the loudest voices instead of explaining the consequences to people. And now that the facts are on the table, let's talk about what actually matters. This week it wasn't about immigration policy changing, it was about immigration enforcement being actually enforced. And everything that happens when the federal government stops pretending it doesn't have the authority and enacts the power that it naturally has. The Trump administration didn't blink. It didn't soften language. It didn't slow operations to appease the loudest voices on social media. Enforcement continued, And the response was immediate and predictable. There were protests, walkouts, disruption, and, liberal escalation as usual. That's the pattern now, and if you don't see it, you must be blind. When enforcement happens, the streets activate. The billionaires' dollars go into the pockets of these blue-haired freaks, and they print their signs, and they buy their rape whistles, and they cause a scene, like children. And here's the part that the media keeps skipping over. It's the protests. They didn't stay in public squares. They didn't stay on sidewalks with, permits and megaphones. They moved inside, into churches, into infrastructure, into spaces that exist specifically to be protected from political coercion, like the hotels that these ICE agents are trying to just sleep at. That shift, it matters because public protest is protected, but the obstruction of justice is not. The minute activists move from demonstrating against enforcement to physically interfering with it or disrupting unrelated civil activity, they cross a legal line. And that line exists for a reason, because the country cannot function if any group can veto a federal law by showing up and just getting loud and blowing their whistles or, shining flashlights and lasers in the eyes of people. So let's talk about the funding, because this is where the pressure campaign, it becomes pretty freaking obvious. The Department of Homeland Security didn't suddenly become controversial just this week. DHS funding didn't accidentally land on the chopping block. It's being used deliberately as leverage. The message from certain corners of Washington is clear. Change enforcement or we'll jam the system. And they can only jam the system because the funding has already been issued. It's already been voted on, and Democrats voted for the funding for ICE. So now they're backtracking, and they're trying to pretend like they're some kind of heroes to their party. That's not oversight. That's hostage taking, and the administration knows it. So instead of retreating, it's held the line, and enforcement comes while Congress postures. Operations move forward while activists, they chant. That's not chaos. That's governance under pressure. And Trump is the best at it. Trump's administration is the best at governing under all the pressure that the liberals can, apply. Here's the uncomfortable truth, though, is that the narrative warfare, it has been replaced with some kind of policy debate. Activists, they're not trying to change the law through legislation. They're trying to delegitimize the enforcement of the law itself by redefining it as cruelty and reframing these officers as villains by turning every arrest into a frickin' moral play. Or a morality play, rather. And the media plays its role perfectly. Every confrontation is framed as oppression. Every enforcement action is treated like outrage. The goal is not reform, it's to frickin' paralyze the system, because if enforcement can be made socially unacceptable, it doesn't matter what the law says at all. The laws don't enforce themselves, though. And the government either acts on it or they frickin' surrender to these people. This week showed which path the administration is going to choose, and that's definitely not surrender. Federal authority doesn't disappear because people dislike it. Immigration law doesn't become optional because protests, trend online. The churches don't become a political shield just because activists decide to move indoors. If you go inside of a church and you protest, you're going to be held to the standards of the law, because we have something called free religion here, and we have the ability to practice our religion without being protested here in America. Those people are going to get what they deserve, and so be it. There's a difference, and it's an important one, between lawful protests and deliberate obstruction. One is protested, the other is prosecuted. And pretending those are the same thing, it's not. That is how you erode the rule of law while claiming you're defending it. So when you hear phrases like peaceful resistance used to describe blocking access or disrupting services or interfering with federal operations, understand what's happening. Language is being weaponized to excuse the behavior that would never be tolerated if the political roles were ever reversed. This isn't a debate about compassion. It's a test of authority. And you know that they would If these roles were reversed, they would prosecute every single one of us and call us what they call us right now, Nazis. This week, the federal government answered that test by continuing to enforce the law, not apologizing for it. That's the collision we're watching unfold right now. Authority versus pressure. It's law versus spectacle. It's enforcement versus some kind of media narrative. And it's not going away. And here's where the record backs that up. That wasn't symbolic enforcement. Federal agencies continued active operations under existing immigration law passed by Congress. It's upheld by the courts, and it's enforced by every modern administration, including Obama. Let's not forget how many people Obama deported through the same agency called ICE. No new authority has been created. No emergency powers have been invoked. Enforcement simply continued without being slowed or paused. It's been sped up a little bit. It's been funded. The protests didn't erupt because policy changed. They erupted because enforcement, it didn't stop, and they're sad about that. That's verifiable. The DHS confirmed ongoing operations. Courts issued no injunctions halting enforcement. Warrants remained valid, and the system functioned, and the response followed. What changed was the locations and the intensity of these crazy people, these so-called protests. Demonstrations, they moved from public spaces into protected and private venues again. They included houses of worship and critical infrastructure. Federal law draws clear distinctions here. Public protest is protected. Interference with protected activity is not. And that's statutory. That's not political at all. That's why law enforcement responded differently as behavior had changed, not because of viewpoints, but because the location and the conduct. Now look at Congress. DHS funding didn't suddenly become contentious due to, budget math or something. It became leverage. Funding negotiations were explicitly tied to demands for changes in enforcement posture. That linkage, it was stated openly, on the record, on liberal media. That isn't oversight, it's actual pressure, and despite it, enforcement continued because Trump doesn't care. The administration is going to enforce the laws no matter what, and this is what we voted for. Historically, enforcement is undone through delay, defunding or intimidation. This week showed that it's a different approach. It's maintain operations while political conflict plays out. That's institutional discipline, not escalation. That's just doing your job and keeping your head down until we come up with a solution. And, I think the solution is to keep doing what you're doing. Fuck these liberals. The media response followed, though, and it's always the familiar script. Enforcement was reframed as cruelty. Officers were, reduced to symbols. Legal actions were treated as moral emergencies rather than statutory outcomes. Context was stripped away and replaced with a frickin' narrative, their narrative. But the legal framework, it's never changed. The law always remains, and it's enforced. Federal authority remains intact. Jurisdiction remains federal. What are they going to do about it? They're a state within the federal confines. What changed was the administration's willingness to absorb its backlash instead of avoiding it. They said, you know what? These people are going to freak out. Let them. That's the signal that they sent this week. This wasn't about winning arguments. It wasn't about executing authority under pressure. It was about enforcing law despite protest or leverage or some kind of narrative warfare that these Democrats are constantly trying to use with their liberal media outlets. And that's why this movement, it matters. When enforcement holds under pressure, it sets the precedent. Not just legality, but institutionally. It establishes that law is not optional or conditional or subject to some veto by disruption or chaos. It's the collision that we're watching right now, not because enforcement went too far, but because it did not retreat. It stood its ground. Let's slow down, and draw a clean line because the noise around this case is deliberate. This segment, it's not about whether you like Don Lemon, but it's about his politics. And it's not about verdicts or speculations. It's about boundaries. Here are the facts that matter. Lemon was charged over conduct, not speech. And the indictment, it doesn't criminalize an opinion, a broadcast, or like a sentence spoken into the microphone. It alleges actions taken against people during a protest. Actions, prosecutors say, crossed from observation into participation. And if you watch the video like I have, which I encourage you to do if you don't know what I'm talking about right now, he was participating in the protest with the pastor. The pastor asked him to leave, and he said he was expressing his free rights, but he didn't know the law now, did he? And that distinction, it's everything. Journalism has protections, yes, but also activism has protections, but they're not the same thing. A journalist, it documents events, and an activist, it seeks to influence them. When those roles blur, the legal protections, they change. That's not a new rule. That's a framework that the First Amendment has always operated under. And this case, it matters because it forces a question the media has always avoided for years. What happens when journalists stop covering, protests and they actually start joining them? Like we've seen, this is what liberal media does nowadays. They're not covering protests. They're starting them. They're joining them. They are the protest on TV. We all know that. Press credentials they're not a force field, though. They don't suspend the law. They don't convert physical presence into some kind of immunity. They don't grant the right to obstruct, to interfere, or disrupt activities that are otherwise protected, especially when those activities involve religious worship or civil access. This isn't theoretical. Courts have ruled on this repeatedly. The press is protected from censorship, not from consequences tied to their conduct. That's why the government's position matters here. Federal prosecutors are not arguing that Lemon's reporting was illegal. They're arguing that his behavior, if proven, it crossed a statutory line. The law doesn't ask who you are. It asks, what the fuck did you do? And that's why the immediate media response was so telling. Within hours, the framing was locked in, as usual. Press freedom under attack, But no one stopped to ask the more uncomfortable questions. Where does reporting end and actual participation begin? Because answering that would require admitting that the modern media culture has blurred that line intentionally, and that they do it every single day. This case matters beyond one individual because it sets precedent, not about silencing journalists, but about defying the limits that apply to everyone equally, limits that prevent activism from hiding behind a freaking camera lens. And here's the part that the loudest voices, they don't want to confront. If press credentials automatically nullified enforcement, then journalism would become the most powerful legal shield in the entire country. Anyone could obstruct anything so long as they called it coverage of a situation. It's not freedom of the press. That's immunity without accountability at all whatsoever. No one here is declaring guilt. That's for the courts. But the legal question is already clear. Does participation void protection? And the answer historically has always been yes. This moment isn't about punishment. It's about precedent. It's about whether the rule of law applies consistently or whether certain professions get you the ability to operate above the law. The press has enormous power in this country. With that comes great responsibility. And when journalism becomes indistinguishable from activism, the law doesn't bend to preserve a narrative. It enforces the boundaries. And that's the line. This case, it forces us to see whether the media, it likes it or not, because the First Amendment protects speech. It doesn't protect obstruction. Because this statute involved in this case, it carries a nickname, and the media keeps repeating it without explaining the Ku Klux Klan Act, the KKK Act. That name is doing a lot of emotional work, and it's being used intentionally by the liberals as usual. The reality of it, though, is the law at issue is a post-Civil War civil rights statute designed to stop conspiracies to interfere with the constitutional rights of others. Not speech, not opinions, interference. Coordinated action that prevents people from exercising protected rights, voting, access to courts, or religious worship. That's the scope. That's the text. And that's how it's been applied for freaking decades. The statute does not ask what someone believes. It does not care about who someone freaking votes for. It does not grant exemptions based on profession. It asks one question and one question only. Did multiple people act together to interfere with someone else's protected rights? That's it. So when you hear the phrase KKK Act thrown around as if the government is equating a journalist with a hate group, understand what's happening. That's narrative warfare. It's an attempt to turn a legal question about conduct into a moral panic about identity. And that's what the Democrats love to run with, identity. Everything is about their feelings and who they are and how you perceive them. Courts, they don't rule on nicknames. They rule on elements, intent, agreement, action, interference, specifically, And this is why the government theory matters far beyond this case alone with Don Lemon, because if participation in a disruptive activity is proven, the statute applies no matter who you are, a journalist, an activist, a private citizen, the freaking politician, the president. The law doesn't bend around your resume. This is the line modern media culture has tried to erase for years now. Journalism hasn't just covered moments, it's always embedded inside of them. They're marching with them, they're chanting with them. Sometimes they're physically obstructing alongside of them. And then when consequences appear, retreating behind the press badge, as if proximity alone confers their immunity, and them just saying, hey, look, we're the press, freedom of the press here. That doesn't apply in every situation. And I think they're getting scared because the law is coming back. The rule of law is coming back to America, and Trump is not looking the other way. The First Amendment was never designed to be a cloak for coordinated interference. It protects reporting. It protects publication. It protects criticism of the government. It does not protect collective action that blocks others from exercising their rights. It can never interfere with somebody else's rights. And that's the precedent question this case raises quietly, legally, and without no slogans at all. Again, when does a journalist stop being a witness and becomes a participant? Because once that line is crossed, the protections change. Not as punishment, as structure. No one here is arguing guilt. That's not my role. But the boundary is real, and it exists for a reason. If the press were immune from laws governing obstruction, then government itself would become optional. An action could be stalled. Any service could be disrupted. Any institution could just be shut down as long as someone held a camera and claimed coverage. I'm the press. That's all you would need. That's not a free press. That's an unaccountable press. This case isn't about silencing dissent. It's about whether the same rules apply when the person involved has a recognizable name and a freaking media platform. And the law's answer, historically, consistently, has been clear. Rights are protected, but interference is always going to be regulated. That's not radical. That's the freaking rule of law, liberals. And whether the media likes it or not, that boundary, it's not going away, at least for the next 3 years. So let's pull the camera back from the streets, to the systems. Because while protests make noise, institutions, they make outcomes. And this week, while the media was fixated on disruption and outrage cycles as usual, the Trump administration made a move that actually freaking matters. And that's the nomination of the new chair for the Federal Reserve. And that's not a headline built for viral clips, but it's the one that shapes the economy. The Federal Reserve isn't symbolic power. It's actual operational power. It influences interest rates, inflation pressure, credit availability, and market confidence. It touches mortgages, business lending, consumer debt, and like government borrowing. It reaches into almost every corner of economic life. So when Trump nominates a Fed chair, that's not a side story. That's a statement about direction. Markets understand this immediately, even when cable news pretends not to. Investors don't react to the slogan, they react to the signal. And a Fed chair nomination signals how aggressively inflation will be confronted, how tightly monetization policies will be controlled, and how much tolerance will be for economic drift versus discipline. That's why markets moved, not because of outrage, but because of the recalibration that's going to occur. Now, compare that to the media response. Instead of explaining that what a Fed chair actually does, the coverage, they defaulted to panic, language, controversial, alarming, destabilizing. The same script, just a different institution. The focus wasn't on policy mechanics, it's on personality and it's on optics. That's the disconnect that's been going on for years that the liberals just don't understand. The administration is operating on a long-term institutional timeline where the media operates on this 24-hour outrage, cry yourself to sleep clock. That contrast matters. Reshaping institutions isn't loud, it's procedural. It happens through nominations, confirmations, regulatory posture. And quiet shifts in authority, it doesn't trend, it compounds. This is how power actually works, not through protests, not through viral moments, but through control of a system that outlasts the fucking news cycle. That's why this moment fits the broader pattern we've been discussing all episode. While critics focus on street-level disruption, the administration, it's reinforcing federal reach, economically, administratively, and structurally. Here's, the key takeaways. You don't govern by reacting to outrage. You govern by setting conditions. The federal chair nomination is about setting conditions for years, not days. It's about shaping inflation expectations, not winning a little segment of time. It's about stabilizing leverage, not chasing people's approval. The media can panic all it wants. Markets will stabilize. Markets will still price reality. Institutions will still function, and policy will still, outlast protest every single time. This is the difference between some kind of spectacle and an actual strategy. And this week made it clear, which side is playing which game. While the streets were loud and the commentary class was, hysterical as usual, foreign policy kept moving forward quietly, deliberately, and without any kind of an apology. This administration is not apologizing anymore. This week, the Trump administration approved major arms sales to Israel and Saudi Arabia. Not symbolic gestures, they're not statements of hardware, it's actual hardware with capability and deterrence. That's what matters, because foreign policy isn't about some kind of vibe. It's about actual leverage and being able to hurt your opponent if you need to. Arms sales aren't signals. They tell allies who they can count on. They tell adversaries where the red lines are actually at. And the message sent this week wasn't a quiet one. It was a blunt one. American partnerships are back to being transactional, to being strategic, and to being enforced rather than endlessly negotiated into a position of weakness for America. The signal to Iran and its regional actors was unmistakable. The United States is reinforcing allies that sit directly in the path of Iranian influence and proxy warfare. That's not escalation, that's deterrence. And deterrence works when it's credible, consistent, and unambiguous. And when it's from the United States, because everybody in the world now knows that the person sitting in that chair, he doesn't play around. And if you want to FA, well, you can FO. Contrast, that with prior administrations where every foreign policy move came wrapped in hesitation and disclaimers and diplomatic paralysis that deals with delay, and the allies second-guessed everything we did. Our adversaries tested every freaking boundary we made because boundaries were never really clearly drawn, and that's something Trump is great at. He is, say, cross this line in the sand and we're going to take you out. That era of, trained hostile actors to probe, push, and wait us out, it's over. The approach it's the complete opposite. Instead of endless talks, it delivers capacity. Instead of signaling restraint, it signals readiness. Instead of apologizing for American power, we just use it. And here's the part that never makes it into the coverage. It's while domestic critics, they protest and they posture, global actors are paying attention to actions, not slogans. They're watching supply lines, defense commitments, and response times. They're watching whether the United States still backs its allies with something more than a statement, than some freaking words like Joe Biden. This week answered that question, and the answer is an overwhelming yes. The administration didn't pause foreign policy because protests were trending. It didn't delay decisions because commentators were uncomfortable about it. It acted as usual because global power doesn't wait on domestic consensus. And, the reality, the outraged crowd refuses to accept is America can govern internally and project strength externally at the same time. In fact, historically, it has to. Foreign policy isn't a group project. It's a chain of command. While critics march, allies rearm. While pundits debate tone, deterrence, it gets built. While outrage cycles spin, strategy, it gets compounded. This isn't recklessness, it's clarity. And clarity is exactly what adversaries fear the most. So let's put it all together, because when you zoom in, the pattern it's not impossible to miss. This week made one thing clear. There are two very different realities operating at the same time in this country. One side, the administration, they govern. It enforces law, it nominates institutional leadership, it funds allies, it exercises authority, it makes decisions, it doesn't ask permission. On the other side, the opposition protests, it marches, it disrupts, it escalates, it tries to apply pressure where it no longer has votes or leverage. When policy doesn't move, then the streets do. And standing between the two is the media. Doing what it does best right now. It's amplifying chaos instead of explaining power. Every protest becomes a crisis. Every enforcement action becomes a scandal. And every assertion of authority becomes controversial. It becomes the Gestapo. We're Nazis because we're enforcing the laws that the Congress created. And then they're sitting there pretending like they didn't even create the laws. It's insane. The noise keeps getting louder, but the institutions, they're functioning. So the Department of Homeland Security is still operating. The Federal Reserve, it still matters. Foreign policy is still moving. The markets are still reacting to signals, not a bunch of freaking slogans. And our allies are still measuring our commitment in hardware, not headlines. Despite the shouting, the system, it's working. And that's the uncomfortable truth for the liberals. This week wasn't about collapse. It was about contrast, about watching in real time who is actually exercising power here and who is trying to stop power by making things loud. Governments don't fall because people protest. They fall when institutions stop functioning. And that didn't happen this week, and it's not going to happen underneath Trump's powerful leadership. What happened instead was this. Enforcement continued, boundaries were tested, institutions were reinforced, and the strategy moved forward without outrage, because the outrage burned itself out by the next news cycle. That's not chaos. That's control under pressure. So when you hear that, this country is spiraling or whatever they say, ask a better question. Who's acting and who is reacting? Because policy doesn't trend. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't care what fucking hashtags say. Policy is policy, and policy operates. This week showed very clear who is operating and who is just making a bunch of noise. And if you want reporting without hysteria, context, without the spin, and analysis that actually explains what's happening instead of feeding the outrage, go to 4547blog.com, sign up for our free blog. Share this episode with someone who's tired of the noise and who wants the facts framed clearly. We'll be back next week, cutting through the chaos, breaking down the power moves, and telling you exactly what matters, whether it trends or not. Thank you for joining me, and have a good week.